I was alone and deprived of even the simplest joys in life. My days were filled with longing and loss. Every memory of my loved ones only intensified the pain in my heart. My military past left me with only one functioning eye and ear. A concussion completely deprived me of hearing in the other ear. I remembered how I received these injuries, but pride in the resilience of my comrades and our joint sacrifice simply didn't allow me to regret my decision to join the army at that difficult time for the country. The burning in my chest was not caused by old wounds. First, my son Ignacio perished. The young man confidently followed in his father's footsteps, but fell in battle in a foreign land, far from home. My wife and I had a difficult time, but we got through it. We learned to live together with the bitterness of loss. And as if that wasn't enough, years later, she was gone too. The cancer came on subtly and quickly. I watched my loved one wither away in my arms, and I was completely powerless at the time. And now, as an old man, I was completely alone. I had no family and no friends. One cold fall evening, when the wind was whistling in my ears and the rain was falling like a bucket, I decided to take a walk around the old places. I went to the memorial where the names of those who didn't return from battle rested forever. My heart trembled with sadness, but pride in my son's bravery softened the nightmare. Suddenly, in the twilight, I noticed the figure of a young man sheltering under a tree. There was something familiar about his face, reminding me of my own son. I approached him and asked, "Young man, what are you doing here in this weather?" He looked up and our gazes met. In his eyes, I saw the reflection of my own loss and pain. "I lost my father in the war," the young man replied. "I usually come here to honor his memory." I understood that this young man needed support as much as I did. We sat down on a modest bench under the tree and began to talk. He talked about his father, his dreams and hopes. I, on the other hand, remembered my wife, my son, my painful losses. Of course, there was a gulf between us, as there is between all such different generations, but that didn't bother us. On the contrary, the young man, called Miguel, was even more interested in how people lived in times when he was not yet born. That meeting marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship between two people united by pain and loss. We decided to meet there every day for support, to share those moments of memory that bring so much pain, but are important for maintaining a connection with the past. The young man respected my experience and wisdom, and I admired the enthusiasm and energy of youth. With each encounter, I gradually felt my heart grow lighter, the pain I carried inside me give way to hope, and the warmth of friendship. Together with Miguel, we found the strength to bear the loss and move on. Sometimes, for our meetings under the tree, I would bring chess, and sometimes Miguel would bring strange board games with complex rules, unusual to me. Surprisingly, I was interested in discovering these games. For my age, I had an extremely curious and lively mind, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. At first, I didn't suspect the young man's true motives. I just saw him as someone who needed support, just like me. We spent a lot of time together, sharing our stories, and I began to trust him. However, over time, I began to notice something strange in the young man's behavior. He was overly curious about my apartment, asking about its location, size, and even the price. A suspicion began to stir inside me, but I tried to push it away, wanting to believe in my new friend's good intentions. "Miguel, son, don't get me wrong," I narrowed my one eye, "but it's strange how you talk to me. Why do you want to know when my apartment was last renovated?" "Mr. Neo, I just want to know if the living conditions in your area are good," replied the young man, raising his eyebrows and shrugging his shoulders. "I'd like to move to a quieter neighborhood. You said your neighbors are very quiet, the streets are always clean, and everything you need is always at hand. I'm listening to you while I mentally calculate the cost, and separately, how much the renovation will cost. Of course, I'm also thinking about whether it would be comfortable for me to live with the layout of your apartment. Maybe I'd be more comfortable in a 3-bedroom, who knows?" However, every time the conversation turned to the apartment, I felt discomfort in my heart. I tried to convince myself that it was just my military training that made me see threats where perhaps there were none, but the doubts wouldn't leave me. I knew I needed to resolve this situation, but I didn't want to accuse my friend without serious proof. I decided to leave everything as it was, but to remain vigilant. After all, I just wanted to believe in my new friend's goodness and honesty. But something about his behavior sent a chill down my spine. During one of our walks through the streets of the city, the young man began to insinuate that I should ask him for help with financial matters. I listened attentively to his words, but an alarm bell went off inside me. The young man claimed to know ways to help me profit from the government by selling my apartment and guarantee my financial stability for the remaining years of my life. He talked about connections with influential people, about the possibility of sorting out all the formalities and getting the desired result. Do you really like living in an apartment that's falling apart? You told me yourself that the furniture is slowly breaking down, the appliances are going crazy, and there are problems with the plumbing. I listened to his words, but doubt swirled in my head. I wondered why the young man was so interested in my financial situation and was willing to help me for free. An inner voice told me that something was wrong. I understood that decisions in this situation had to be made carefully. I decided not to give the young man a final answer, and instead said that I would think about his offer. After deep reflection, I realized that I needed to consider the situation carefully and be prepared for any possible consequences before making any decisions. But after a few days, when the kitchen sink clogged again and the cupboard door fell to the floor with a bang, I gave in. Even though I only had a short time to live, I still wanted to end my days in comfort and coziness. And that was my biggest mistake. The young man, who turned out to be a scammer, was willing to employ any depraved methods to achieve his goal. He conducted a thorough analysis of the situation and found a legal loophole that could be exploited to bankrupt me and strip me of the apartment. Examining my situation, he discovered that I had some tax and utility debts. Using this knowledge, he found a loophole in the legislation that involved the forced sale of the debtor's property to pay off their debts. The scammer thoroughly researched the laws and procedures relating to my eviction from the apartment and its sale at auction. He took note of my weaknesses and vulnerabilities and decided to exploit them for his own selfish ends. Using his legal expertise and connections with influential individuals, the scammer arranged for me to be declared a debtor and my apartment to be auctioned off. He ensured that the sale price of the apartment was significantly below market value. The scammer employed various manipulations and put pressure on government structures to ensure the successful execution of his nefarious plan. He was willing to do anything to benefit from this situation, even if it meant causing untold suffering for me. So the legal loophole the scammer found involved using my debts to forcibly sell my apartment at a reduced price. This cunning plan allowed the scammer to achieve his goal and deprive me of my only refuge and source of stability. I, being honest and unprepared, was completely unprepared for such high levels of deception and cruelty. I couldn't imagine that someone could stoop so low as to exploit my vulnerable position for their own gain. When the scammer carried out his cunning plan, I was literally thrown out onto the street, deprived of my only shelter and documents. This terrible turn of events left me in complete despair, lost and helpless. For me, it was a blow from which it was very difficult to recover. I felt betrayed and deceived, trapped by the scammer who had ruthlessly exploited my weaknesses and vulnerabilities. A feeling of helplessness and despair overwhelmed me, but along with it, a fire of anger raged inside me. Anger at the world, which not only took away everything I had, but also continued to crush me. Anger at myself for allowing myself to trust a young man without seeing his true intentions. And finally, anger at the young man who mercilessly destroyed my last vestiges of dignity and peace. Bastard, miserable, I muttered with bitterness and resentment as I rolled over on the hard bed in the homeless shelter. I fought for a better life for people like him so that youth would have a peaceful sky above their heads. Old fool, look where your confidence has gotten you. The workers from the charitable foundations that ran the shelters where I used to stay just shrugged. The only thing they could do was provide shelter and modest food for the needy. They listened to my story but couldn't say anything in response. They didn't know what to do in such cases, nor did they know who to turn to. Each new day became a real trial for me. I would wake up in my lonely world, where the walls of the shelter seemed too tight and the memories of my past were too heavy. Fighting the pain became increasingly difficult as I remembered my days in battle and the losses I faced. Vivid images of my beloved wife and deceased son constantly appeared before my eyes like ghosts haunting me. One day, I had a dream that was both beautiful and disturbing. First, I saw my beloved Amelia in it. In this vision, she looked as if she had never been afflicted with illness. Cheeks rosy, eyes sparkling, she smiled at me and held out her hands. I, worn down by the constant struggle for survival, went towards her, and suddenly my steps became so light that I felt 40 years younger. Amelia kept calling out to her husband, drawing me in, gradually moving away from me. I couldn't see where, because of the bright light shining directly into my eyes from her silhouette. I just felt with all my heart that it was good there, but the light suddenly became faint. From somewhere behind, the noise and roar echoed. I froze in place, as did Amelia. It was the roar of war. It was gunfire, explosions, people screaming. It was the rumble of heavy machinery and the roar of aircraft engines. Suddenly, someone grabbed me by the shoulders and turned me around. With astonishment, I looked into Ignacio's face, who was clearly furious with me. "You can't run away from the camp. There was no order to retreat," he shouted, shaking me by the chest. "There was an order to hold position. Are you still listening to orders, Dad? You're not deaf yet, are you? Dad, you'll rest later when the time comes. But not now, it's still early." The young man's face changed. "It's not time yet. Can you hear me?" I nodded abruptly. I didn't fully understand what my son meant, but I decided to support him. I turned my shoulder and saw Amelia's smile slowly disappear from her face. Her gaze became sad, full of deep sorrow. She pressed her hands against herself, and the light behind her gradually began to fade. Ignacio shook me again, not letting me relax. The young soldier pressed his forehead against mine, grabbing the back of my head. "I'll be back tomorrow or in the next life." I saw tears running down my son's cheeks. "Tomorrow or in the next life. But you have nothing to do here, Lieutenant." With those words, Ignacio pushed me hard into the abyss that appeared out of nowhere right behind me. The light was fading, and the roar of war gradually subsided. Falling into the unknown, I felt a deep resignation. Strangely, I wasn't afraid. I felt almost nothing. And then, finding myself in complete darkness and silence, I trembled with my whole body. "What's wrong, Doc?" I looked around and saw Mingo, a vagrant who often stayed at the shelter. He put his hand on my shoulder and looked into my one eye with intensity. I realized that I had woken up. After moving around a bit in bed, I sat up tiredly, rubbing my nose. I felt down and exhausted. I hadn't rested at all during the night. Mingo, the tramp, was obviously expecting some kind of response from me, so I decided to reassure my neighbor. "Nothing, buddy, just a weird dream." Mingo shrugged but didn't hurry to turn around. His face showed that he didn't entirely believe me. My friend seemed very upset. The two of us occasionally exchanged a few words, briefly and without too many details. Mingo simply liked to talk, and I, although too proud to admit it, needed someone to talk to. So we lived. We would meet at various shelters, discuss recent events in our lives, and then quickly go our separate ways. Mingo was a carefree man. He himself said that he never aspired to any great success. My mother used to beat me for getting poor grades at school. My father left us when I was little, so my mother had a hard time with me. The bum laughed every time he reminisced about his childhood. I don't even remember going to school like other children. My mother tried to explain to me that I was born special. At the time, I took it as a compliment, but now I understand that I was a bit of a fool from birth. That must have been an unpleasant discovery, huh? Ha! It would have been if I'd cared. Stupid, clever, brilliant. Mingo threw his hands behind his head and stretched. "We all ended up on the same floor, so what's the difference? Look, Doc, I don't have a house, a car, a wife and kids. Sometimes I have nothing to eat, and sometimes the sole of my only pair of boots falls off. Still, I'm happy." I'm as free as the wind in the field, and that makes me happy. Maybe it's all because of my inherent stupidity. I paused for a moment. I looked away, contemplating this man's fate. I admired Mingo's ability to find joy in every little thing. I couldn't understand how he could find positives in every situation. Not that I was particularly despondent or pessimistic, but as an old man, I definitely wanted to live in completely different circumstances. I longed to go back to my aging but beloved apartment. I wanted to drink coffee in the mornings and sit in my favorite chair with an interesting book in the evenings. I really missed the photographs of my wife Amelia and our son Ignacio. I suddenly realized how petty my complaints about my past life were when there were people around who were happy just to exist. You know, Domingo, I smiled for the first time in a long time. You really are special. The Lord has blessed you with a happiness that lasts a lifetime. Not everyone can boast such a gift. Mingo laughed in response. We raised our mugs of tasteless coffee and toasted all the good things we had. I found myself increasingly drawn to the company of this carefree vagabond. Maybe Mingo could barely read, didn't know any literary works, and couldn't boast knowledge. But I couldn't deny that instead of diplomas and doctorates, Mingo had acquired something more important: simple worldly wisdom. A few months after that conversation, Domingo passed away. I woke up and looked at my neighbor, feeling a little unaccustomed. Normally, the tramp always woke up before me and enthusiastically shared any news he had, but this time he simply lay in his makeshift bed. I clumsily got up from my hard bed, stretched a little, and looked at my neighbor again. He remained motionless, not moving. Mingo? No answer. The silence was ringing in my ears, contrasting with the general buzz of the shelter. Still unable to understand what had happened, a shiver ran down my spine. I ran over to my friend and immediately pulled the frayed sheet over his head. Underneath, I saw Mingo's serene, lifeless face, already drained of color. His features were completely relaxed, his wrinkles smoothed, and his eyelids softly closed. I froze, unable to move. I continued to stare at my now lifeless companion. Oh, Mingo. Even in death, the tramp's face was lit by a gentle smile, the same one he had carried throughout his unfortunately short life. Later, the charity workers shared with me that my friend had died of a heart attack, just like that, quietly, without fanfare or pain. A friend. Perhaps over the years I had really had a true friend by my side. He didn't need anything from me, except an ear to listen to his happy, though sometimes shocking, childhood stories. I couldn't attend the funeral. I discovered that Mingo had nephews who knew about their rebellious uncle, and Mingo knew his nephews well. He simply didn't want to live like other people. I decided not to cross paths with my friend's relatives to avoid unnecessary questions. It was simply too difficult for me to talk about the vagabond Mingo. A few days later, I went to the cemetery, to the modest grave with a number scrawled on it. I didn't say anything. I just ran my wrinkled hand over the cold little stone and looked at the epitaph, where, in addition to the dates of birth and death, kind people had engraved the phrase I had said to them. Surprisingly, the nephews decided not to change anything, just agreeing with the recommendations of some stranger from the shelter. Apparently, they also knew what kind of person their uncle was. And I'm still happy. That was the phrase that completely described the man's life. Before I left an old rusty metal keyring in the shape of a smiling heart near the headstone, which had fallen off the stretcher when Mingo's lifeless body was taken away. I believed that my duty was to fight, even if the world was unfair to me. I didn't ask for sympathy or help from young people. Throughout my life, I preferred to follow my own path, despite all the difficulties and trials I had to endure. Sunday taught me not to get upset over trivial things. Yes, I was poor and lonely, but I lived. I breathed that air. I looked at the blue sky. However, with each passing day, my physical strength diminished and my health deteriorated. Battle scars and the consequences of injuries sustained during the war years became an unbearable burden on my aging body. My deaf eye and ears served as reminders of how much had changed since I was young and strong. However, despite all the difficulties, I continued to fight, refusing to give in to old age and illness. I never imagined that a chance encounter with a vagrant would awaken in me such a strange will to live. Deprived of my only shelter and wandering from one shelter to another, I exemplified resilience and perseverance. I would take any job offered at the job center, regardless of my age and physical difficulties. However, despite all the adversity, I stubbornly rejected offers of assistance and care in old people's homes. Over the years of wandering the city streets, I became increasingly reserved and proud. My life experience and resilience made me too adamant to accept help from young nurses and caregivers. I believed that young people shouldn't burden themselves with caring for elderly and frail men and preferred to remain independent and self-sufficient. For me, it wasn't just a question of pride, but also a question of my perception of the world. A man whose youth was spent in inhumane wartime conditions could not accept the idea that his less healthy condition deserved attention and care from the younger generation. My view of the world was marked by firmness and determination, and I preferred to fight for my existence independently, without depending on others. One day, when there was no work at the job center and not enough money for even the simplest meal, I felt a hunger that persistently demanded satisfaction. The shelters were also full. There simply wasn't enough food for everyone. I realized that I needed to eat something to ease the pain in my stomach. Struggling to move through the streets, I began to pick up coins from the ground and the alleys. Despite my tiredness and physical difficulties, each coin was valuable to me. Each one brought me closer to the possibility of buying something to eat, and their number grew a little. I found myself in front of the counter of a small store, where fresh bread on the shelves caught my eye. The feeling of hunger became unbearable, but in my pockets were only a few coins that I had managed to scrape together during the day in the alleys. I approached the counter slowly, with my back bent and my steps uncertain, as if each step took a tremendous effort. I took a loaf of bread and began to contemplate my motives, my situation, and what my conscience was saying about it. What have I come to? Theft? I thought to myself. You've lived on a few spoonfuls of water a day, half a dry cookie a week. Look at you, what a situation. I only felt ashamed of myself for such thoughts crossing my mind. Suddenly, I shuddered at the thought that I had almost stolen the most common bread in the store. I sighed heavily, more as a reproach to myself, and prepared to put the extra loaf back on the counter, casting my gaze downwards. It was just then, as I was about to put it back, that I heard a rustle and felt heavy eyes on me. As I turned, I saw a young, stern security guard eyeing me suspiciously and approaching. "What are you doing here?" asked the guard with a displeased expression on his face. I'd like to buy this bread," I replied, my voice weak and shaky. "Then why did you take 2 if you only wanted to buy 1? asked the guard, without taking his eyes off me. "But I put the second one back, didn't I?" "Yes," I stammered, trying to explain the situation. I felt that every word I said only increased my suspicion. The guard insisted that I had taken 2 loaves of bread, but I only intended to pay for 1. My heart was beating faster. I felt shame and pain at being suspected of dishonesty. I silently handed the guard the unpurchased loaf, but he just nodded and pointed to the door. "Come with me." I turned slowly and approached the security guard, feeling the bitterness of the offense and the pain squeezing my heart. I realized that there was no place for the weak and poor in this world, and that I would have to fight even harder to survive. While searching my pockets, the guards found 2 valuable items that initially didn't catch their eye. A combat medallion and a piece of yellow paper folded into a small square. Unfolding the paper cautiously, they saw an old children's drawing, stained by time. The drawing showed a soldier next to a woman and a child. In the background was a representation of a house. The soldier had his hand on the woman's shoulder, and the child, hugging his leg, was smiling happily. The inscription on the drawing read, "My daddy is a hero." The guards' gazes moved from the drawing to my face. In my one eye, they could read the thorny paths I had traveled and the endless sadness. It was clear at that moment that life's circumstances had led me to this position, far from my own mistakes or failings. The guards were horrified to realize how wrong they had been to judge me and subject me to humiliation. They understood that the person in front of them was not just a stranger, but a hero whose sacrifices and suffering deserved respect and recognition. "So you're a veteran?" One of the guards coughed nervously, asking. I just nodded silently, unable to say anything. With understanding and regret, they returned the medallion and the drawing to me. The guards decided to help me, at least as far as they could at the moment. It was obvious that I was very hungry, as evidenced by the modest loaf of bread I had been holding in my hands for so long in front of the counter and by my scrawny figure. Explaining the situation to the boss, the guards asked for a brief leave from their post. They accompanied me to the nearest cafe and paid for my meal. "Take what you want," one of them put his hand on my frail back. "Please forgive us. It's all because of our work. We have to keep an eye on everything. Surely you know how many scoundrels roam around." I smiled at them gratefully, looking into their faces with eyes full of gratitude. At that moment, a spark of hope ignited in my heart, that perhaps there were still good people in this world, willing to help those in need of assistance and support. After the guards realized their mistake, when I returned from the cafe, they invited me into the staff room to better understand my situation and learn my story. Inside the room, silence reigned, interrupted only by the sound of the pendulum swinging on the wall and the silent footsteps of the guards accompanying me. "Please sit down, Lieutenant." A young man called Pedro placed the first available chair in front of me. "Tell us what happened to you. Why is a hero like you forced to survive instead of living?" Sitting in the deteriorating chair, I began to tell my story. I talked about my service in the army, my family, the losses and suffering I had faced. My voice was quiet, but full of bitterness and sadness. Each word sounded like a heartbeat, full of pain and hope for justice. And in the end, old and lonely, I found a cheat. At this point, my voice trembled with bitterness. I hoped to have found a friend with whom I could share the weight of loss and the burden of loneliness, but he had completely different plans. He cheated me, took everything I had, and that was that. Listening to my story, the young people couldn't contain their anger. They clenched their fists, feeling the anger rising against those who dared to mistreat such a person. This man, who once fought for the well-being of the country, was a hero, but now he found himself alone and vulnerable, hit by such a despicable coup by scammers. Pedro's father fought at the same time as the late Ignacio, so the story of the wounded veteran touched him more deeply than the others. He couldn't imagine for a second that his father would end up wandering the streets, suffering from hunger and cold, completely alone, completely unwanted, as if forgotten by the whole world. The women in the room couldn't hold back their tears. Many of those present had elderly grandfathers or even elderly fathers. They were the dearest people in the world to them, and now, in front of them, stood the most miserable person they had ever seen. When my story reached the beggar Mingo, everyone present heard a soft sob, carrying sincere pity and regret. "Mr. Neo, don't run away from us," Andrea managed to say with tears in her eyes. "You're a proud man, that's obvious. You told us so yourself. Please don't disappear. We'll help you." The young people, who were the first to become acquainted with me, promised to do everything possible to help me. They promised to help me restore my rights and get back my house, which was illegally taken from me. They promised not to leave me in the lurch and to support me as soon as they could. The women present, for their part, began to worry about current problems that could be solved immediately. My room is empty now. I used to live with my son, but he's grown up, got married, and has his own house, his own family. Carmen, the accountant, who was no longer young either, began from afar. "You can stay with me for a while." "We won't bother. I'll be at work during the day, and at night we'll each have our own room. It's better than sleeping in a shelter under thin sheets, isn't it? And I'm updating my husband's closet. We were looking for somewhere to put his old clothes. Don't think they're bad. They've just gotten too big for my husband now." Louisa began to justify, offering the elderly man a cup of coffee. "And you, although you're quite thin now, were certainly robust in your youth. His clothes might fit you." "We don't mind. It would be a waste to throw them away." I smiled gratefully at them, feeling a little relieved that there were people willing to help me in this world where I felt betrayed and forgotten. Suddenly, there were kind souls ready to reach out to me. I hadn't deliberately sought help, enduring my sad existence in solitude. But this was a small light in the darkness, giving me hope for a better future. After a serious conversation with me and realizing the gravity of my situation, the store staff decided to do everything they could to help me regain a dignified life. Getting together, they discussed a plan of action. One of the first steps was to get more information about me. They decided to check the veterans database to find my name and military service history. When they found my records, it became clear to them that I really was a veteran who had served the country with honor and bravery. Photographs from my younger days only confirmed this. Confident facial features, proud posture, and a determined look. Even more recent photos, where I was already wounded and retired, emitted such a powerful energy and thirst for life that it touched the hearts of young people. Realizing that this soldier was now leading a miserable existence, inspired by my story and desire to help, the store employees embarked on more active actions. They contacted local veterans organizations and charitable foundations to find out how they could help me return home and provide me with support. In addition, they organized fundraisers among store employees and contacted communities on social media for assistance. Their initiative had a widespread response, and people were eager and a little proud to help a veteran who found himself in such a difficult situation. With each passing day, the support for me grew. I felt less lonely and helpless, knowing that I was being supported and helped to return to a dignified life. The Veterans Foundation provided me with contacts of other men who served with me at the same time. Some of them were living with their families, while others were enjoying life in nursing homes among other dear old people. For the time being, I used Carmen's computer to communicate with them, as she liked to have coffee with me in the evenings and listen to my life stories. The volunteers promised to buy me a phone as soon as my new documents were processed. The Veterans Foundation responded immediately to the pensioners' situation and organized a fundraiser to help me. Thanks to the generosity and support of people who believed in the importance of supporting veterans, the funds were raised quickly. One of the first steps was to restore my lost documents. The Veterans Foundation collaborated with the relevant authorities to resolve this issue quickly. Thanks to their efforts, I had all the necessary documents confirming my identity and veteran status restored. "Make sure you call me whenever you want," Carmen exclaimed excitedly in the store where she had gone, especially with the volunteers and me. "You'd probably be better off with a phone with buttons. Even touchscreens are complicated for me. Guys, I don't understand all these models, but since you deal with money, choose something more reliable for the pensioner." "Oh, ma'am, every old person needs a friend like you," laughed one of the volunteers. "To worry like that. Don't worry, we'll choose a model that you can handle. We'll take your eyesight and motor skills into account. You just need to be there to help if you need it." The woman nodded in satisfaction. Through me, she could see her long-dead father. Just the tone of his voice brought her back to those times when she was just a young girl. Now, remembering that pleasant feeling of some kind of family support, she couldn't tear herself away from this touching old man. "Carmen, what would I do without you?" She smiles. "You taught me about computers, and now you're getting ready to help with the phone. You're just an angel, darling." Choosing a phone, considering such a support group, was one of the simplest tasks in my case. In fact, the volunteers took into account all the peculiarities of the pensioner they were tasked with looking after. But the public residents went beyond the usual assistance to a veteran. My case also caught the attention of the police authorities. It turned out that not only I, but many other pensioners in the city had been victims of similar acts of fraud. The police began an investigation, and soon the fake portraits were compiled. It was through these that the criminals, including the same Miguel who cheated me, were apprehended. Once the criminals had been identified by the police authorities, an investigation began. The police arrested the criminals who had taken my documents and apartment and charged them. I felt a sense of justice and satisfaction knowing that those who had caused me so much pain and suffering would finally be held accountable for their actions. The Veterans Foundation also provided financial support to repair my apartment. Thanks to this, I could return to my home, which had been illegally taken from me. The repairs were done quickly and with quality to create comfortable conditions for me. Carmen had become so used to my company that she even shed a tear when it was time to say goodbye. Even I was moved by such warm affection from a completely unknown woman. In difficult times, we promised to call each other every night to talk or support each other in times of sadness and to visit each other for coffee together. What's more, thanks to the Foundation's efforts, my right to receive my pension was restored. I was no longer deprived of this important source of income, which enabled me to support myself. The Veterans Foundation continued to support me, providing the necessary assistance and care so that I could live with dignity and peace of mind as I deserved. It seemed like the story should have ended there, but it didn't. One day, someone knocked on the door. I was very surprised because Carmen and I hadn't arranged to meet. As I approached the door, I saw through the peephole a completely unknown young woman whose features carried some inexplicable melancholy notes. "Hello, do you live here, Mr. Neo?" The stranger had a strong Oriental accent, which intrigued me even more. "I really need to talk to you. Please don't send me away." Her appearance seemed unusual and even exotic to me. There was something mysterious and attractive about his facial features and the way he dressed. With particular caution, I nevertheless opened the door. The man shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other, examining the stranger's face. "Do you need anything?" "Yes and no. Look, this is going to sound very strange." The girl hesitated and took a deep breath before quickly saying, "I'm your granddaughter, Ignacio's daughter." I let out a bitter laugh. How absurd. After a scammer, I wasn't going to believe in fairy tales. "Oh, of course, you're my granddaughter, and my son is still alive drinking cocktails straight from coconuts somewhere on the beaches of Sri Lanka." "I can prove it." The uninvited guest grabbed the door with her hand, not allowing me to close it. "I have a whole folder with photos, my birth certificate, everything is there. Please, Isidro, look at them." I narrowed my one eye. I still viewed the girl's claim with skepticism, but for some reason I decided to let her in and show her what she had collected in a whole folder. The girl quickly explained that thanks to the efforts of the Veterans Foundation, our story had been heard almost all over the world. From the description of the appearance and the unit number, she recognized her grandfather and the ragged old man, whom neither she nor her mother had been able to contact because of the language barrier. It turned out that my son, who served in the army, was in a romantic relationship with a civilian woman. He was planning a wedding, but didn't have the chance to share this joyful news with his family. Unfortunately, Ignacio died before the celebration, never knowing about his beloved's pregnancy. And here, this is Dad next to Mom. She was already pregnant here, but Daddy never knew. The girl was visibly saddened, handing one of the photos to her supposed grandfather. "This is my favorite. It represents the family because if you know that Mom was already carrying me in her womb at that time, you could say that this photo is of our whole family, right?" True. I looked at the photo, now slightly yellowed with time. Samira had grown up so much that it was hard to believe it was all real. The pain of Miguel's betrayal still lingered in my heart. I really wanted to believe Samira, but I couldn't. Not even the positive experience of friendship with the tramp Mingo could help me open my heart. I remained silent for a long time, looking at the photos, unable to voice my suspicions. But suddenly, the girl took my hand. "Isidro, I don't need anything from you, not even Mom." She looked into my eyes. "We can do a DNA test." "All right, I was prepared for that outcome. I can even pay for it. I just don't want you to be alone. I want you to be part of the family. After all, Dad was your biological son, so you should stay with us." I asked for a few days to make up my mind. Instead of simply leaving, Samira left her favorite photo with me. Only when the girl left did I decide to hold the photo in my hands. On the back, I saw a short inscription that brought back all the unshed tears of sadness and loneliness. The handwriting clearly belonged to the late Ignacio, and the inscription read, "I will come back to you tomorrow or in the next life." The next day, I called Samira to tell her my decision. The girl came to my house to pick me up from the hospital. We sat in long anticipation of the test results. The doctors, seeing such a strange pair coming for such a strange reason, couldn't contain their surprise. Finally, the doctor appeared in the waiting room to hand over the results. Well then, the probability of kinship is 81%. I don't know if that's good news for you, but you're definitely second-degree biological relatives. Samira smiled warmly at me. She was sure that I was her grandfather, but the expression on my face was difficult to describe in simple words. For me, this discovery was a real shock. I never thought that my family had been looking for me all these years. In my lonely life, there was no room for joy or happiness, and suddenly I discovered that I had a granddaughter who wanted so much to meet me. With a slight tremble, I reached out to the girl and cautiously hugged her. The notes of melancholy I saw on her face were special, completely unique from my late Ignacio. Only now, knowing the results of the test, did I decide to recognize her. Meeting my granddaughter became a source of excitement and joy for me, feelings I hadn't felt for many years. We shared memories, told each other about our lives and plans for the future. For me, it was a moment of real happiness when I felt part of the family I had been looking for so long. Thanks to the efforts of the Veterans Foundation, my life was filled with new hope and possibilities for a happy future. As the granddaughter talked about her life and how she and her mother had always looked for me, she opened up new horizons of family connection and love for me. We spent long hours discussing plans for the future. For the granddaughter, it was also an important moment. She met the grandfather she had heard about for many years, but had never seen. Meeting him brought a sense of completeness and satisfaction. She felt that everything was now in place. Gradually, I began to embrace my new role, the role of grandfather. I helped my granddaughter with advice and support, sharing my stories and knowledge. The granddaughter happily welcomed me as part of the family, graciously accepting me into her life. We had big plans ahead to meet Samira's mother. She hadn't yet decided to move, so the approach to the meeting needed careful consideration. However, for some reason, I felt only pleasant anticipation. Not every old man embarks on a great journey at the age of 85. Carmen, on hearing the whole story of her granddaughter's arrival, was overjoyed. The woman felt peace, knowing that her elderly friend now had someone who would never forget him. Yes, she and Ignacio were close, but nothing could replace genuine family ties, and she felt deeply honored when, just before she left, I decided that Samira should meet her. The trio spent an extremely cozy evening together. The atmosphere was warm, almost familiar, and at the end, the girl smiled and said she would be happy to visit the woman with her grandfather. Meeting my granddaughter gave me something I had missed so much for a quiet old age: family. Now I had people who loved and cared for me, who shared joys and sorrows with me, and who were always there for me in difficult times. It was a reward for all my suffering and hardship, for all my life dedicated to serving my country.